I knew a heart could crack quietly, but I never expected mine to split on a Christmas Eve phone call. One simple sentence, delivered with practiced politeness, carried enough weight to undo years of pretending I was not being pushed aside. It was the kind of wound that does not bleed, but reshapes you, hollowing out the places where hope once lived. And yet, that moment became the spark that forced me to face the truth. I had been waiting for a place in someone else's life while forgetting I could build one of my own. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you are tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we are grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you have not already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Maggie Ellis, and at 63 years old, I have learned that a house can feel both full and empty at the same time. I live in a modest, weathered home on the quiet edges of Richmond, Virginia, a place where brick sidewalks remember more footsteps than most people do. The neighborhood has changed over the years, but my routines have not. I still wake before sunrise, put the kettle on the stove, and listen to the familiar creak of the floorboards that have held my life together longer than anyone else has. The walls are lined with photographs from decades ago. My late husband grinning in the garden, my son Jeremy in his Halloween costumes, and a younger version of myself who once believed holidays were guaranteed to bring people together. Most mornings I stop by the bakery run by Mrs. Harris, who always remembers that I prefer my pastries warm. She chatters while I listen, grateful for the noise that fills the spaces my family used to occupy. Afterward, I return home to read by the window, watching the light move across my living room as though it has its own quiet plans. My days have a gentle rhythm, but there is a hollowness underneath, the kind that builds slowly over years of being needed less and noticed even less than that. Richmond is beautiful in December. Storefronts glow with wreaths tied by careful hands, and the church bells ring with a sweetness that tugs at old memories. Families hang garlands together, children run ahead of their parents, and windows shine with the promise of celebration. I decorate my house just as carefully as I once did when Jeremy was small, setting out the same ornaments I kept wrapped in tissue for decades. Some are faded, some chipped, but each carries a moment that still lives inside me. When I place them on the branches, I feel both pride and a small ache, as though I am speaking to ghosts who will never answer back. Jeremy lives several hours away now, married and building a life that no longer has space for me. I tell myself this is normal, that adult children drift, but the truth is less gentle. He visits rarely, calls out of obligation, and moves through conversations as though he is eager to reach the end. I still cook the same holiday meals I used to make for him, even though I eat them alone. I tell myself tradition matters, even when no one shares it. Maybe especially then. Nights are the hardest. I sit by the tree with its soft glow reflecting on the window, creating the illusion of warmth spreading outward. Outside, neighbors celebrate with music and laughter. Inside, the silence feels heavier than the cold. I do not resent them. I only wonder when my own home stopped being a destination and became a memory. Still, there is a part of me that waits. I do not say it out loud, but every December I hope something will shift, even a little. Maybe a door will open again. Maybe I will not spend another holiday hearing only the hum of the heater for company. For now, though, I stand in the quiet and let the lights of the tree shine on me, holding a tenderness that feels like both comfort and longing. If you are still watching, and this moment struck something familiar in you, comment number 1 below so I know you are still with me. Now let us move on to chapter 2, where the first cracks in everything begin to show. Christmas Eve has a particular stillness to it, a kind of quiet that presses gently against the windows and makes every sound sharper. That night, I moved slowly around my living room, adjusting an ornament here, straightening a ribbon there, pretending that these small tasks mattered. The tree glowed softly in the corner, washing the room in warm light that felt almost tender. I told myself I was content, that years of practice had taught me how to carry a holiday alone. Yet beneath that calm surface, a restless hope kept stirring, the same fragile hope that always rose when December arrived. When the phone rang, the sound cut through the silence so suddenly that my heart lifted before my mind could catch up. I stood there for a breath, letting the familiar possibility settle over me, and then I answered. Jeremy's voice came through the line, smooth and polite, the way he always sounded when he wanted to keep a call brief. For a moment, I let myself imagine he might say something different this year, that perhaps he and Amanda had realized how much I missed them. But then the words came, the same arrangement of syllables I had memorized through repetition. He said they were keeping the celebration small again. He said he hoped I understood. There was no anger in his tone, no impatience. That somehow made it worse. It was the kind of gentle dismissal that closes a door without a sound. I responded with practiced warmth, my voice steady. When the call ended, the living room seemed to fall back into its heavy quiet, as though the air itself had exhaled. I set the phone on the table and let my eyes adjust to the shifting lights of the tree. They flickered cheerfully, unaware that I had drifted somewhere far from cheer. I sat for a long time at the dining table, staring at the planner that had followed me through years of appointments, birthdays, and reminders. The December page was mostly empty, save for a few notes taken out of habit. I traced my finger over the blank days, feeling the weight of all the invitations that never came. Then, slowly, deliberately, I opened to the final week of the month and wrote the sentence that had been forming inside me for longer than I admitted. Next year, do not wait for an invitation. The words felt heavier than the pen, as though placing them on paper gave shape to something that had been quietly growing inside me. Later that night, restless, I opened my laptop and scrolled through local listings without much intention. My eyes paused when a photograph of an old mountain cabin appeared. The wood was weathered, the paint fading, and the porch leaned slightly to one side, but the setting was breathtaking. Tall pines, open sky, and a sense of solitude that looked peaceful rather than lonely. I clicked on the listing, studying every detail. The cabin reminded me of the dreams my husband and I once shared, long before life reshaped itself into something smaller. I closed the laptop, but the image stayed with me, vivid as though I had walked through that doorway myself. For the first time in years, my thoughts drifted toward a life that did not revolve around waiting for someone else to choose me. I imagined mornings filled with mountain air instead of stale silence, evenings warmed by a fire I built for no one's approval but my own. I stood at the window, watching the lights from neighboring houses shimmer with celebration, and the reflection of my face in the glass made something inside me settle with clarity. The pattern of being forgotten would not break on its own. If change was going to come, it would have to begin with me. If you are still watching, and the tension is starting to build for you too, comment number 2 below to let me know you are following this journey. Now, let us step into chapter 3, where the real turning point arrives. The morning I left Richmond for the Blue Ridge Mountains felt different from any morning I had lived through in years. The air was crisp, almost sharp, carrying the scent of winter and the possibility of something unplanned. I drove with both hands steady on the wheel, following winding roads that cut through stretches of bare trees and open fields. I did not tell anyone where I was going. For decades, every decision in my life had revolved around someone else's needs, schedules, or preferences. This quiet drive, pointed toward a place no one had chosen for me, felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. A part of me was frightened by that freedom, but a deeper part felt strangely awake. When the mountains finally appeared in the distance, rising like dark blue shoulders against the sky, I felt a shift inside my chest. The cabin from the listing sat at the end of a narrow gravel road. It looked older than the photographs, with a porch that leaned forward as though tired of holding its own weight. But the landscape surrounding it was breathtaking. Tall pines framed the property, and beyond them, the valley dropped into a sweep of rolling hills that glowed faintly under the pale winter sun. I stood still for a long time, letting the silence of the place find its way into me. Inside, the cabin was humble. Uneven floorboards, a stone fireplace with soot stains, 2 small bedrooms, and a kitchen that would need more than a little work. The real estate agent, a warm, practical woman named Cassandra, walked me through the space with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times, yet I barely heard her explanations. I was absorbed by the feeling of the place. The air smelled of cedar and dust, but also of possibility. There was something deeply personal about standing inside a shelter untouched by the disappointments of my recent years. Outside again, I wandered behind the cabin to a slope overlooking the valley. The wind moved through the trees with a deep, steady sound, almost like breathing. I realized then that no one knew where I was. No one was expecting anything from me, and no one could interrupt this moment. It was the first time I had felt that kind of quiet in so long that I could not remember when it last existed. Without giving myself time to retreat into caution, I decided I would buy the cabin. The decision came out of me as simply as an exhale. When the papers were signed, I felt a flutter of disbelief. I had just used my savings on something that belonged entirely to me, something not meant for Jeremy's future, not for family gatherings, not for anyone else's comfort. I drove home with the keys beside me, glancing at them as though they might vanish if I looked away too long. Later that week, I posted a single picture of the cabin online. I did not expect a reaction, but Jeremy called within an hour. He congratulated me, though the enthusiasm in his voice sounded practiced. Then he shifted, mentioning that their house renovations had become chaotic, that Amanda was stressed, and that they needed a quiet place to stay for a while. His tone suggested the cabin was the obvious answer, as though my purchase had been a solution arranged for them. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to rearrange my life to make room for theirs. But something held me still. A few days later, during a visit to town, a neighbor mentioned rumors about a failed investment Jeremy had made, money troubles, debt, a need for temporary refuge. Suddenly, the request to stay in my cabin did not seem like a simple family visit. It felt like the beginning of a new kind of intrusion. I returned to the cabin one more time before going back to Richmond. This time, the view was the same, but my understanding of it had changed. The cabin was no longer just a dream. It was a boundary, and I sensed even then that I would soon have to defend it. If you are still watching and feeling the weight of what is unfolding, comment number 3, so I know you are still here. Now, let us continue to chapter 4, where the first attempts at fixing things only make the storm grow stronger. Returning home after Jeremy's unexpected request felt like stepping into a version of my life that no longer fit. The familiar rooms, once comforting, seemed smaller, as though they had been holding their breath for years. I sat at the dining table where so many holiday dinners had once been served, trying to understand the heaviness that settled across my shoulders. The cabin had stirred something within me, something fragile but insistent, and Jeremy's assumption that it should be available to him felt like an echo of every moment I had allowed my boundaries to disappear. I realized, with a quiet kind of shock, that I was not willing to return to that pattern again. During the next week, I spent my days at the cabin, repairing what I could and learning the rhythm of the place. I changed the worn curtains, swept away years of dust, and opened the windows to let the mountain air drift inside. The scent of pine settled into the rooms, replacing the stale emptiness that had lingered before. Every task, no matter how small, gave me a sense of ownership that I had never fully understood. I tightened loose screws, replaced an old faucet, and scrubbed the stone fireplace until the stains began to lift. With each improvement, the cabin felt less like a forgotten structure and more like a declaration of independence. The quiet there was different from the quiet in my Richmond home. Here, silence did not feel like abandonment. It felt like space, like a pause between breaths where I could finally hear my own thoughts. I noticed the way the sunlight filtered through the trees at different times of day, how the valley shifted color with the changing light, and how the wind against the windows sounded almost like reassurance. I began to understand that the cabin was not only a retreat, it was a reflection of the life I could still create. But as the cabin grew warmer and more mine, Jeremy's calls grew more frequent. His tone softened each time, trying to coat his request in gentleness. He talked about Amanda's exhaustion, the renovation chaos, the need for peace, yet beneath each word was an expectation I knew too well. My hesitation seemed to encourage him, as though my uncertainty was simply another obstacle I would eventually remove for his comfort. Amanda sent a message, carefully phrased but unmistakably critical, reminding me of family duty and implying that refusal would be selfish. Reading it, I felt a cold line draw itself between us, sharper than anything she intended to say out loud. One evening, after a long day of cleaning, I sat on the cabin floor near the fireplace, letting the warmth seep into my bones. The shadows on the walls flickered with each sway of the flames, and for the first time in a long while, I asked myself why I had lived so many years afraid of disappointing people who rarely considered my feelings. I thought about the countless moments when I had stepped aside so Jeremy could feel unburdened, and how silence had become my way of keeping peace. But peace built on my erasure was no peace at all. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer in town to ask about the best way to protect my property. The conversation was short, practical, and surprisingly empowering. I learned how vulnerable I had been and how simple it was to establish clear boundaries on paper. Leaving the lawyer's office, I felt taller, steadier, as though claiming the cabin had also allowed me to reclaim parts of myself I had long misplaced. As the sun set that evening, I walked outside and looked at the cabin, glowing faintly through the windows. It struck me that this small wooden structure had become more than a refuge. It was the beginning of a life that belonged entirely to me. And as the wind moved gently through the trees, I understood that the conflict with Jeremy was far from over. But for the first time, I was ready to meet it without yielding. If you are still watching and sensing that the worst has not yet come, comment number 4 below to stay with me. Now let us move into chapter 5, where everything finally breaks open. The morning Amanda's letter arrived, the air around the cabin carried the sharp scent of cold pine, a scent that usually settled my nerves. That day, though, it did nothing to steady me. I found the envelope tucked beneath the cabin door, the handwriting neat and perfectly spaced, as if every loop and stroke had been shaped to convey composure. I held it for a moment before opening it, sensing the familiar weight of expectation even before I saw the first line. Inside, the words unfolded in a tone that echoed the polished courtesy Amanda had perfected over the years. She wrote of emotional strain, of her need for quiet before the baby arrived, and of the importance of family coming together during challenging times. Each sentence felt soft on the surface, yet every phrase pressed against me with the insistence of obligation. As I read, a chill settled beneath my ribs. The letter was not a request. It was a declaration framed as gratitude. It presumed I would know my role, that I would understand without hesitation that my home, this fragile refuge I had just begun to claim, should be offered freely to serve their needs. The politeness in her tone did not soften the message. If anything, it sharpened it. I folded the letter once, then again, feeling the quiet throb of realization grow stronger. This was not simply about a place to stay. It was about the expectation that my life still revolved around theirs. I walked to the fireplace, its ash from the night before still warm, and placed the letter inside. The flames caught quickly, curling the edges until Amanda's graceful handwriting shrank into blackened fragments. I watched without blinking, feeling no triumph, only a strange release, as if a chain I had not noticed was finally loosening. The fire hissed softly, filling the room with the scent of burning paper, and something inside me settled with finality. Not long after, the phone rang. Jeremy's name lit up the screen, and the familiar knot tightened in my stomach. His voice, when I answered, carried a calmness that was more acute than anger. He spoke of confusion, of disappointment, of not recognizing the woman he was speaking to. He suggested that my refusal to help was pushing the family apart. I listened, absorbing each word with the quiet clarity that arrives only after years of accepting too little. When I finally responded, my tone did not waver. I had told him the cabin was not available, that it was not a solution for their problems, and that I was choosing to protect the life I was building. A silence followed, stretched thin and brittle, and then the call ended without resolution. Later that afternoon, as I attempted to distract myself with small tasks, a new email appeared. It was from a property management company, thanking me for my supposed interest in authorizing short-term rental oversight for the cabin. Attached was a preliminary contract that, if signed, would grant them extensive temporary control. My breath caught as I read the fine print. This was the type of document designed to confuse, to persuade someone into surrendering rights without realizing it. I contacted my lawyer immediately, sending him the contract. His response was swift and firm. Signing it would jeopardize my ownership. When he asked who had recommended the company, I needed no time to answer. Only one person had something to gain. As the sun sank behind the trees, I sat by the window, letting the weight of the day press fully into me. The valley below darkened into deep blue shadows, and the cabin grew quiet around me. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that the conflict had crossed a threshold. It was no longer about inclusion or exclusion, kindness or neglect. It had become a battle for something far more concrete: my independence, my property, my right to a life that did not exist only in the empty spaces others left behind. The morning after everything unraveled, the cabin felt heavier than usual, as though the air itself had absorbed the weight of the past few days. I sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the fog rise from the valley in slow, pale ribbons. The mountain stillness should have soothed me, yet my thoughts churned with the same steady rhythm as my pulse. Amanda's letter, Jeremy's accusations, and the deceptive contract I had nearly fallen into hovered in my mind like shadows refusing to lift. I kept returning to the same question, one that seemed simple but carried decades of meaning. If I did not protect myself now, when would I ever? That morning, I drove into town to meet with my lawyer again. The sky was still a soft gray, and the trees lining the road looked as though they were holding their breath. His office was warm and quiet, filled with the scent of old books and cedar. This time, I did not come to ask vague questions. I came ready to act. I updated my will, making clear that the cabin was mine alone, managed independently, and not to be transferred without explicit instruction. I revoked older permissions I had once given Jeremy, permissions I barely remembered signing when I trusted without hesitation. I added legal protections, ensuring that no one could lay claim to the property during illness or absence. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I had lost over years of softening my edges for those who rarely considered them. There was grief in that process, though, a quiet grief, the kind that settles in your chest when you realize you must defend your boundaries not from strangers, but from your own child. I stepped out of the office with mixed feelings, lighter in one way, heavier in another. Still, I knew the truth. Protecting myself was not betrayal. It was long overdue survival. That evening, I returned to the cabin and let the fire crackle until the room glowed with amber light. I sat on the rug, staring at the flames, letting memories drift through me. I thought of all the times I had let Jeremy's needs eclipse my own, all the holidays spent waiting for a call that came late or not at all the gentle rejections wrapped in politeness that I pretended did not hurt. I had shaped my life around absence and made peace with crumbs, but the cabin had awakened something that refused to shrink again. When the phone rang, I knew it would be Jeremy before I even looked. His voice sounded tighter this time, stripped of the practiced warmth he usually wore like a coat. He spoke quickly, layering frustration with disappointment, insisting that I was making unnecessary drama, that I was distancing myself from family, that I was not acting like the mother he remembered. Each word attempted to fold blame into my hands the way it had worked so many times before. But something in me had shifted. I listened without breaking, and when I answered, my voice held firm, even though my heart trembled. I told him calmly that the cabin was not available, that I was choosing my own well-being, and that their problems were not responsibilities I could carry. The silence that followed was long enough to feel cold. It was the silence of someone realizing a door he expected to remain unlocked had finally been closed. When the call ended, I did not cry. Instead, I walked outside and stood in the snow, watching the windows of the cabin glow softly against the dark. The mountains stretched out before me, steady and patient, as though reminding me that growth often comes wrapped in discomfort. The choice I made that night would change everything between Jeremy and me. I felt the truth of that as clearly as the cold air on my skin. Yet beneath the ache, there was an unmistakable calm. For the first time in years, I was choosing myself, and the world did not fall apart. If you are still watching, and the choice made in this chapter shook you too, comment number 6, so I know you are still by my side. Now, let us move forward into chapter 7, where decisions begin to show their consequences. In the days that followed my decision, the cabin seemed strangely calm, as though the wooden beams themselves approved of the boundary I had finally drawn. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, steady breaths, but inside, the quiet carried a different weight. Jeremy did not call again. The silence he left behind was sharp at first, a clean cut that stung more than I wanted to admit. I had prepared myself for anger, accusations, and pressure, but I had not expected abandonment. His absence stretched across the hours of each day, settling into the corners of the cabin like a cold draft. I knew the silence was meant to punish me, and knowing that did nothing to lessen the ache. Still, beneath the sadness, something steadier began to form. The decision I had made was frightening, but it was also necessary. I felt myself breathing more deeply, walking more confidently, taking up space in my own life without the constant feeling that I needed permission. Yet even as I grew stronger, I could not deny the grief that lingered. Being a mother had shaped the whole of my adult life, and now I was forced to confront the truth that love alone could not fix a fractured relationship. To keep my hands busy and my mind steady, I threw myself into caring for the cabin. I repaired a loose shutter, replaced a sagging piece of porch railing, and began clearing a small section of earth to plant flowers in the spring. Each task grounded me. Every nail I hammered reminded me that I could build something new, even if the parts of my past felt unsalvageable. The cabin was steady in ways that people were not. It did not ask for more than I could give. It simply waited, patient and loyal. One afternoon, while I was sweeping the porch, my phone buzzed with an unexpected message from Carol, the woman I had befriended in town. Her words were hesitant but urgent, explaining that she had overheard conversations that left her unsettled. Jeremy had contacted several people in the area, suggesting that I was not thinking clearly and might need supervision. For a moment, the world tilted. The mountains, usually so dependable, seemed to shift beneath me. I felt betrayed in a way that went deeper than the earlier requests or demands. This was not just pressure. This was an attempt to undermine my autonomy, to paint me as unstable so he could justify taking control. I sat down hard on the steps, the broom slipping from my fingers. A rush of old memories swept through me. Jeremy as a child clinging to my hand, Jeremy telling me about his first heartbreak, Jeremy leaning against my shoulder at his father's funeral. It was impossible to reconcile those moments with the man now maneuvering behind my back. The betrayal pierced deeper because it came wrapped in familiarity. I had expected disappointment. I had not expected this. Anger rose, steady and clean, not the chaotic kind that blurs judgment. This was anger rooted in clarity. I realized then that defending my boundaries was not cruelty. It was survival. I contacted my lawyer again, explaining everything. His reassurance was firm. The accusations had no legal standing, and any attempt to challenge my competency without cause would reflect poorly on Jeremy, not me. Hearing this steadied me. It reminded me that truth, when protected, has its own strength. That evening, I cleaned the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. I wiped the counters, folded blankets, and swept the floors until the pine boards gleamed. The ritual felt symbolic, as though I was clearing out the residue of fear and doubt Jeremy had tried to impose. When I finally opened the windows, the cold air rushed in, sharp and invigorating. The mountains stretched beyond the glass, unwavering, unshaken. As dusk settled over the valley, I stood at the window and watched the last threads of sunlight fade. The consequences of my choice had arrived, painful and undeniable. Yet I felt something else rising, a quiet strength shaped by loss but not diminished by it. I understood now that the life I was stepping toward required letting go of illusions I had carried for far too long. Some relationships fracture when tested. Some truths reveal themselves only when we stop running from them. And in that fading light, I felt the first true sense of peace. It was fragile, but it was mine. The morning after everything began to settle, I woke to a thin band of sunlight stretching across the cabin floor. It slipped through the branches outside and cast long, warm lines over the wooden planks, softening the quiet that had felt so heavy in earlier days. I sat up slowly, letting the stillness fill me without demanding anything from me. For the first time in a while, the silence did not feel like accusation or punishment. It simply existed, offering space where my thoughts could land gently instead of crashing into one another. I stepped outside, breathing in the cold mountain air until my lungs ached in the best possible way. The valley below was covered in frost, shimmering faintly beneath the early light. Something in me loosened. I realized that despite the hurt, despite the betrayal, I was still moving forward. My heart, tired as it was, continued to push towards something calmer, something better. Later that morning, I drove into town. The cafe at the corner was warm and bright, filled with the smell of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans. Cassandra sat near the window reading the newspaper, and she looked up with a smile that felt genuine and uncomplicated. We spoke briefly, mostly about weather and small-town life, but beneath the simple words was a kind of kindness I had forgotten existed. She did not ask for anything, did not assume anything. Her presence alone reminded me that connection did not always come wrapped in expectations. After leaving the cafe, I found myself walking toward Carol's house. She opened the door before I knocked fully, as though she sensed I needed a soft landing that day. We sat in her small living room, surrounded by the quiet echoes of old memories. We shared pieces of our stories, not dramatic or embellished, but honest. Her grief, shaped by loss, mirrored the quiet ache inside me. Yet she carried herself with a resilience that felt contagious. Talking with her was like being handed a lantern while standing in a dark tunnel, not bright enough to chase away everything, but enough to keep me from stumbling. As the days passed, I began accepting invitations from the people in town. A small gathering for cards, a simple dinner with neighbors, a walk through the trails behind the library. None of these moments were extraordinary, yet each one stitched something back together inside me. I remembered what it felt like to laugh without apology, to be welcomed without suspicion, to feel seen without needing to earn it. Returning to the cabin each evening became a ritual of gratitude. I wrote lists of what brought me peace: the smell of pine and wood smoke, the gentle hum of conversations shared with new friends, the independence that came from caring for a place that belonged entirely to me. Writing these lists gave structure to the quiet and reminded me that healing was not dramatic. It was steady, patient, a rebuilding done from the inside out. Jeremy drifted through my thoughts often, but no longer with the sharp sting that once followed his name. I understood now that I could not force closeness where there was none. I could not keep sacrificing my well-being in hope of restoring something he did not seem to miss. Accepting this truth hurt, but it also freed me. I could love him without allowing his choices to unravel me. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees and washed the cabin in a deep golden glow, I realized I was beginning to create something that felt like a life again. Not the life I once had, not the life I thought I would, but a life shaped by choice rather than fear. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. If you are still watching and feeling the quiet shift inside this story, comment number 8 below to let me know you are with me until the end. Now let us move into the final chapters, where everything finds its meaning. Winter returned quietly, settling over the mountains with a softness that felt almost ceremonial. A full year had passed since the last Christmas I spent waiting for an invitation that never came, and now the cabin felt entirely my own. Snow draped itself over the roof and gathered in gentle mounds along the path, muting every sound except the wind threading through the trees. I had changed in ways that were not loud or dramatic, but steady and undeniable. The woman who once waited by the phone had been replaced by someone who no longer tied her worth to another person's attention. Inside the cabin, the living room glowed with the kind of warmth that comes not from extravagant decor, but from presence. I prepared a simple dinner for the friends who had become the center of my new life. Carol arrived first, carrying a loaf of warm bread. Then Louis, bundled in a thick coat, followed by Claudia and Anne, whose laughter drifted into the room ahead of them. We gathered around the old wooden table, mismatched plates and flickering candles, turning the evening into something intimate and real. The meal itself was humble, but it felt like abundance. It was the first holiday in a long time where I felt held rather than overlooked. Throughout the night, I found myself observing the small moments: Carol's hand resting gently over her cup, the way Louis's eyes crinkled when he laughed, the quiet glances between Claudia and Anne as they shared stories. These were not grand gestures of love, but they were consistent, offered without condition. For so many years, I believed belonging had to come from blood. Here, among people who did not share my history but welcomed my presence, I learned otherwise. When the last guest left and the cabin settled into silence again, I checked my phone. A new message from Jeremy waited on the screen. His words carried a tone of confusion and resentment, questioning why I had time for strangers, but not for him. I read the message slowly, waiting for the familiar ache to form. It did not. Instead, I felt a gentle clarity. Jeremy was still looking at our relationship through a lens that required me to take responsibility for every distance he created. I no longer accepted that burden. I set the phone aside without replying, not out of anger, but out of understanding. Explaining myself had never changed the outcome, and I no longer felt compelled to try. Later that night, I opened my planner, the same one that held last year's promise. Next year, do not wait for an invitation. Beneath it, I wrote one word for the coming holiday season: booked. Not for travel or obligation, but for a life I had chosen deliberately. Snow was falling again when I approached the window. Outside, the world shimmered beneath the pale moonlight, every flake catching the glow like a tiny silver spark. I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet sink into me. The longing that once accompanied winter had faded, replaced by a stillness that felt earned. I understood then that the ending I had reached was not a door closing, but a door opening inward. What became of my choices was simple. I had built a life that wanted me in it. Morning light spilled gently across the cabin walls, warming the cool air and softening the shadows that lingered from the night. As I stood by the window, watching the sun lift over the mountains, I felt a hum that had taken me a lifetime to understand. The quiet was no longer a reminder of who was absent. It was a reflection of who I had finally become. For years, I searched for belonging in a place that offered only conditional affection. Now, belonging lived here, in the steadiness of my own choices. I thought about the long path that had led me here. I had spent decades shrinking myself to fit the expectations of a son who never learned how to see me clearly. I had waited for invitations, for apologies, for recognition. None arrived. What came instead was a realization that waiting had cost me too much. Choosing myself had been painful, but it had also given me a life rooted in honesty rather than longing. The friendships I found in this mountain town had shown me a quieter form of love, one built not on obligation but on genuine care. They reminded me that family can be found in the spaces where you are welcome without question. I no longer measured my worth by what Jeremy withheld. I learned to measure it by what I nurtured within myself. Forgiveness came softly, not for Jeremy, but for the woman I once was. She did her best with what she knew. Now I knew better. I opened my planner and wrote a simple sentence: "This life is mine." Then I stepped onto the porch, letting the cold air wrap around me like a new beginning. I was not too old to start over. I was finally old enough to understand how. There comes a moment in every life when quiet becomes a teacher. It reveals what noise once hid, the truth that peace is not something given, but something built from the courage to choose yourself. Growth often begins at the edge of loss, where familiar patterns fall away and the heart learns to stand without leaning on what once felt necessary. In that stillness, a new strength appears, steady, self-authored, and deeply earned. It reminds us that dignity is not a reward but a right, and that starting over is never a declaration of failure. It is an act of honoring the years that remain. Thank you for sharing this journey. If the story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment, follow, and subscribe so we can continue exploring these stories together.